There was one particular mutiny so despised by the British Royal Navy that they came up with a special and unimaginably cruel punishment just for the men who participated. A small wooden cage bolted directly onto the exposed surface of a ship called the HMS Pandora, barely big enough to crouch in. The men who carried out the mutiny were locked inside and shackled at the ankles. Under the tropical sun, the box turned into a scorching sauna, making it hard to even stay conscious. And at night, waves crashed over them, soaking their raw skin in salt water. After more than 3 months of this relentless torture, the worst part came. They found themselves sinking into the ocean depths inside the still locked box. But what had the men inside done to deserve a fate like this? 2 years earlier, on April 28, 1789, the mutineers had left their captain and 18 of his loyal sailors in an overcrowded 23-foot boat, essentially giving them a death sentence. The nearest European settlement was over 3,600 miles away across shark-infested waters. The captain and his men had supplies for 5 days at normal rations, and the wooden boat was so overcrowded that the edge stood just 7 inches above the waterline. One decent wave would send them all to the bottom of the Pacific. Every survival expert today would give them zero chance of making it. They had been left in a floating coffin, destined to become yet another mysterious tragedy in the vast Pacific graveyard. But what unfolded over the next 48 days makes you wonder if the universe keeps score. While the mutineers believed they were sailing toward paradise, they were actually drifting toward a nightmarish island and a string of grim fates. Some were murdered, some were captured, and others ended up in the infamous Pandora's box. And the men they had condemned to die, they were about to find salvation through the very discipline their captors had rejected. The seeds of this incredible drama were planted 2 years earlier in 1787, when the British Royal Navy purchased a small merchant vessel, renamed her HMS Bounty, and assigned Lieutenant William Bligh a peculiar mission: sail to Tahiti, collect breadfruit plants, and transport them to the West Indies as cheap food for slaves on British plantations. After a grueling 10-month journey halfway around the world, the Bounty finally reached Tahiti in October 1788. What happened there changed everything. For 5 months, the crew lived among the Tahitians. Picture this. After months confined in a cramped wooden ship, eating salted meat and hardtack, these sailors suddenly found themselves in a tropical paradise. Warm weather year-round, abundant fresh food, and Tahitian women who, by the standards of 18th century Europeans, seemed remarkably free in their relationships. Many crew members, including Fletcher Christian, formed deep attachments with Tahitian women. Christian fell in love with a woman named Mawatua. For these sailors, it wasn't just a physical paradise. It was freedom from the rigid hierarchy and harsh discipline of naval life. When it came time to leave in April 1789, the psychological whiplash was severe. One day, you're living freely in paradise. The next, you're back to the cramped quarters, rotten food, and strict discipline of a British naval vessel. Fletcher Christian wouldn't have seemed like someone to become a mutineer. In fact, he and Bligh had sailed together before on very good terms, and Christian had once deeply admired his captain. But something changed during this voyage. Bligh was known for his sharp tongue rather than physical punishment. He would publicly humiliate his officers, and Christian increasingly became his favorite target. The verbal abuse wore Christian down, day after day, eroding his self-respect and mental stability. And on April 27, 1789, just 1 day before the mutiny, Bligh accused Christian of stealing coconuts from the ship's stores. It was a small thing, almost trivial, but for Christian, it was the final humiliation. We'll never know exactly what went through Christian's mind that night as he paced the deck. Was the mutiny carefully planned or a desperate impulse? What we do know is that by dawn, Christian had made a decision that would condemn many men to death, including, eventually, himself. The mutiny itself was surprisingly bloodless. Armed with bayonets, Christian and his supporters roused Bligh from his bed at dawn. As Bligh was forced onto the deck in his nightshirt, he shouted, "The mutiny itself was surprisingly bloodless." Christian and his supporters rose early, grabbed bayonets, and seized the ship at dawn. Christian allegedly had a sounding plummet. a heavy weight used to take depth readings, hanging from his neck, presumably so he could jump overboard if the mutiny failed. The deck erupted in chaos. Bligh shouted continuously, addressing some of his men by name, ordering them to restrain Christian and the men. But his authority had vanished, and the loyalists were outarmed. Bligh and 18 loyal crew members were loaded into the ship's launch, a small boat never designed for long voyages. The mutineers threw in some bread, water, pork, a compass, and a quadrant for navigation. Then they cut the rope. Let's be clear about what Bligh faced. The launch was so overloaded that the edge of the boat stood only 7 inches above the waterline. One decent-sized wave could sink them instantly. Their meager supplies would last 5 days at normal rations. The nearest European settlement was Timor, 3,618 nautical miles away. Bligh's first decision was to sail to nearby Tofua Island for supplies. It nearly proved fatal. As they attempted to leave, natives attacked, killing John Norton, the quartermaster, with stones. Bligh and the others barely escaped with their lives. In that moment, Bligh made a crucial decision that almost certainly saved them all. No more island stops, despite the risk of starvation. Too many islands in this region were hostile or practiced cannibalism. They would sail directly for Timor. What followed was a masterclass in leadership and survival. Bligh implemented strict rationing. Each man received just 1 ounce of bread per day, about 1/16 of normal rations. He maintained meticulous navigational records and kept his men's spirits up through the worst conditions imaginable. The tiny boat battled 20-foot waves during storms. When it rained, they collected water. When it didn't, they suffered terribly from thirst. The men were constantly soaked, developing painful sores where their wet clothes rubbed against their skin. Many begged Bligh to let them drink seawater, which would have hastened their deaths. He refused. Could you have survived this? Packed shoulder to shoulder with 18 other men for 48 days, with almost no food, alternating between blistering sun and freezing rain, watching the horizon for any sign of land? Meanwhile, what became of Fletcher Christian and his fellow mutineers who thought they'd found freedom? At first, they returned to Tahiti, their paradise. But Christian knew that's the first place the Royal Navy would look once Bligh reported the mutiny. Christian convinced 8 mutineers to join him, along with 6 Tahitian men and 12 Tahitian women. They set sail to find somewhere, anywhere they could hide forever. After months of searching, they discovered Pitcairn Island in January 1790. It was perfect, small, fertile, and most importantly, mischarted on British naval maps. No one would find them here. In a dramatic gesture that sealed their fate, Christian ordered the Bounty burned. As flames consumed their only link to civilization, the mutineers must have watched with mixed emotions. There was no going back now, but their island paradise quickly descended into hell, with only 9 European men and 6 Tahitian men competing for 12 women. Jealousy and violence erupted. The Europeans treated the Tahitian men as slaves rather than equals. Within 4 years, only 1 mutineer, John Adams, remained alive. Some were murdered in their sleep, while others took their own lives. Fletcher Christian himself was reportedly shot while working in his fields, but the exact circumstances of his death remain mysterious, with conflicting accounts from the survivors. Their escape from authority had created something far worse than the discipline they'd rebelled against. Back in the Pacific, something remarkable was happening. Despite impossible odds, Bligh's boat stayed afloat and his men stayed alive. On June 14, 1789, 48 days after being cast adrift, the skeletal survivors spotted Timor. When they pulled their boat onto the beach at Kupang, they could barely walk. Their clothes hung in tatters from emaciated frames, but they had achieved the impossible, traveling 3,618 nautical miles in an open boat without losing a single man to the sea. Bligh's log recorded the voyage with astonishing precision. Even in their most desperate hours, he had maintained his duties as a naval officer. We know their exact route because he never stopped recording it. The irony? After surviving the voyage, several men died from diseases contracted on land. After conquering the Pacific, they were killed by the comfort of civilization. Bligh returned to England in March 1790 and was celebrated as a hero. The public was captivated by his survival story. Bligh was quickly promoted and given command of another breadfruit expedition, which this time he completed successfully. The British Admiralty was not about to let mutiny go unpunished. In 1791, they sent HMS Pandora to hunt down the mutineers. The ship captured 14 men in Tahiti, including some who had been forced to stay against their will. Captain Edwards showed no mercy. He imprisoned all 14 in a specially built cell on deck called Pandora's Box, a cramped wooden cage where men could neither stand nor lie down comfortably. But nature intervened again. The Pandora struck the Great Barrier Reef and sank. 4 of the Bounty prisoners drowned in their floating cage before the cell could be unlocked. The survivors eventually reached England, where they were court-martialed. 3 were hanged from the yardarm of HMS Brunswick. 4 were acquitted, and 3 were pardoned. As for the remains of Christian's group on Pitcairn, they remained undiscovered until 1808, when an American whaling ship found the island. By then, John Adams was the only surviving mutineer, living with several women and numerous children, the descendants of the mutineers and their Tahitian companions. Remarkably, no action was taken against Adams. He had transformed from mutineer to patriarch, teaching the children to read using the Bounty's Bible. Today, a small community of about 35 residents still lives on Pitcairn Island, most of them direct descendants of those mutineers. Another 1,000 descendants live on Norfolk Island, where some Pitcairn families were relocated in the 1850s when their population grew too large for the tiny island. The so-called tyrant, Captain Bligh, survives against all odds, his discipline and leadership keeping his crew alive through one of history's most remarkable voyages. The supposed heroes, men chasing freedom, end up creating something far worse than what they escaped. On Pitcairn, their new world collapsed into violence, paranoia, and death. Bligh found salvation in duty and order. Christian found ruin in freedom without boundaries. And maybe that's why this story still grips us more than 200 years later. It asks the uncomfortable questions: when is rebellion justified? What is freedom without structure? Can paradise exist without rules? The mutiny on the Bounty reminds us that the line between utopia and chaos is razor thin. And sometimes the hardest part isn't escaping tyranny. It's surviving what comes next. If you enjoy stories like this, consider liking and subscribing. We share true tales of survival, grit, and human resilience every week. See you next time.